we're starting.
Sounds good.
So I'm Will Snyder. I'm on the Envirothon committee, and uh, I'm really glad that Joel Betts is here to give us a presentation on soil conservation as it relates to water quality and climate change. And because there's some really important science connections there that will be really helpful to understand, I think, as we look at the big picture. So I'll let Joel tell you a little bit about his background and then get into it.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you for giving the opportunity to talk about this. I enjoy working with high school students, and it's too bad we can't do more of this in person, but I'm hoping this will be a resource to all the different teams and especially to the folks who are on the call today. And I really appreciate you all being here. I'm going to share my presentation to introduce myself quick, since I've got a little slide. 1 minute. How's that? Will, do you see my presentation?
Yes, it's up.
Great. All right. So I'm Joel Betts. I'm a conservation planner with the Worcester County Conservation District here in the Holden office. We work really closely with the Department of Agriculture, and my background is I'm a watershed ecologist, so climate change and water management is an issue close to my heart and something I care a lot about. And currently I'm working on that by helping people adapt soil conservation best management practices, especially farmers, but also landowners and people who manage lawns, all sorts of different kinds of properties. So my main job is reaching out to those people, but also providing education and outreach. We've worked with Envirothon a lot in the past, and other ways of outreach as well. So I'm excited to have this opportunity. And I wanted to mention just briefly a little bit about the history of soil conservation efforts in the U.S. Because this isn't the only conservation district. There's actually 3,000 across the country. Almost every county has a conservation district, and those were established because of the Dust Bowl, which was a terrible natural disaster that happened because of poor soil management practices back in the 1920s and 30s. Here's some pictures from it. You can see lots of soil erosion, really barren fields, and the government responded to this by setting up a conservation district in every county, and setting them employees to work closely with farmers to make sure that never happened again, and really to prevent soil erosion and promote water quality, which you'll see through this talk are closely related. So there's a lot of these throughout the whole country, and I'm excited to be part of one of those here in Worcester County. And ours has existed since the 1940s. And what we do and what we have done, one of our main things is our spring seedling sale that we help people plant trees. We've been selling tree seedlings since the 1950s throughout Worcester County, and providing also agricultural perennials, blueberries and apples and things like that. But then more recently, we've really started working closely with farmers and landowners, and we've been doing that for a while as well, through providing workshops and outreach on soil health, sustainable agriculture practices, invasive species control, and wildlife habitat conservation. And then I also provide soil testing services and technical assistance. So even this year, I was out on 75 different people's properties, did over 100 soil samples, and helping people to figure out how to manage their soil sustainably, which we'll get into a little bit more. So talking about your current issue, water management and climate change, I want to make the point that soil management is a really important part of water management. You can see in this picture here one example of why that might be the case. So in this picture, it looks like it had just rained a lot on this agricultural field. And what you can see there is a lot of deposition of soil and actually water flowing through that soil, and causing a lot of erosion. So, if you don't use good agricultural practices, you get something like this. This is not what you want to see, where soil is actively being eroded by these temporary streams that bring it to our water bodies and cause sedimentation of our water bodies, but not just that. Anything that was applied to this field, like fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, is also, flowing downstream and with the soil and with that water from that agricultural landscape into our water bodies and causing problems. So, how we manage the soil really impacts water quality, and therefore is really important in water management. And you can kind of get at that by understanding the concept of a watershed, which I'm sure you've heard in some of these other talks and being part of Envirothon. But a watershed is the area of land that drains to a common point. So you can see this in this diagram here. We've got agricultural land use, we've got a city, urban land use, some suburbs, maybe there's a golf course somewhere, you've got some forest. So anything, all the ways that these land pieces are treated, whenever water hits it, it brings that water eventually to our water body and flows to that common point, which is the river in this case. So whatever happens to the land in a watershed that drains to the water body affects the quality of the water in that water body. So when we're talking about soil management, we're talking about how you manage your crops, your agriculture, your garden, your lawn, anything you do to the soil, to the land, that's going to eventually affect our waterways. And so, as you can see in this example, we've got an algal bloom, a toxic algae that's happened because of excess nitrogen and phosphorus from agriculture getting into that lake. Our drinking water reservoirs have to work harder to filter out sediments and pollutants if we don't manage our soil well. You can see an example here of an unfiltered water from a contaminated reservoir, for example. And something we don't think as much about is actually what's living in our water bodies and how the way we manage the soil affects those. So here we have some fish eggs, the salmon eggs, which hatch into these fry and become adult salmon. Well, if salmon need really kind of open gravel areas to spawn in. Well, if we have a lot of sediment from erosion from agricultural fields, that gets rid of those habitats, and there's actually no space for salmon to spawn in, and therefore you won't have salmon in a river. So, there's some of these more subtle ways that soil management affects not just water quality, but the animals that depend on the quality of the water, including ourselves, right? Because it does come back to us. So how does climate change relate to all this? Well, climate change threatens soils in a number of ways that are connected with water as well, and you can see that in this picture. So one prediction and one thing we're maybe already seeing as a result of climate change is that we'll have more frequent heavy rain events. So more frequent heavy rain events because of climate change can increase soil erosion or loss of topsoil, like you see in this picture here, which is obviously that topsoil is vital to growing crops and healthy forests. That first 6 to 8 inches of soil is where most of the productivity of the soil is, most of the life of the soil is. So if we're losing that in these heavy rain events to erosion because of poor land management practices, that's going to affect our ability to grow crops. But not just that, it's also going to affect our water bodies, because as we lose, like I mentioned, as we lose sediments, agricultural chemicals, and nutrients, as they're washed away from exposed soils and lawns, fields, and pastures into our waterways because of runoff from this heavy rain that might be happening, those impact water quality. So if we're getting more heavy rain events, we have to make sure that we're using the landscape in a way that prevents soil erosion and then prevents those impacts to waterways. Another way that climate change is threatening soils is by drought. Actually, this year, the state had to declare a state of emergency because we had so little rain this summer. So it was, a moderate drought this year that we experienced, maybe even worse than that. And so drought conditions can degrade soil health and further contribute to climate change, because water is essential for soil and plant life. Everything that's living in the soil and also the plants that need the soil, with less water, less frequent rain events, we might have some negative impacts to the health of the soil. And also hot and dry conditions actually increase the rate that soil carbon, which I'll be talking about, is turned into carbon dioxide. And also that soil nitrogen is turned into nitrous gas. That not only limits the availability of these food sources for soil life, it also contributes to climate change directly, because those are both greenhouse gases. So if we're losing those from the soil, we're not only losing a valuable resource for plants and animals that live in the soil, we're contributing to those to the atmosphere. So drought has a couple of negative ways that it interacts with soil in terms of climate change impacts. Another one that I didn't mention here is you can see in this picture how platy the soil is. Well, when water hits that, a lot of it runs off. So we don't actually get as good of water absorption. So, when you have drought, you have some of these other negative impacts. And climate change is said to potentially increase the frequency that we have droughts. It's going to increase rain, and it's going to increase droughts, which is confusing. But the way that, as I understand it, it's predicted is that we'll have more frequent heavy rain events, less dispersed throughout the season potentially. And year to year, there's going to be more variability. It'll just be less predictable. So like this year, it might be a good example of that. We had some really heavy rains at different times, but we had less frequent or less consistent rain. And that's really hard on soils. So I've been mentioning soil health. I want to help you guys understand that and define that and talk about how it interacts with climate change. But the point I'm going to make is that investing in the health of the soil increases its resilience to these effects of climate change. So resilience is something that I think will come up a lot in this current issue, which is water management and climate change, because resilience is kind of a term that helps us understand like how to create systems that can withstand the impacts of climate change. So healthy soil, which I'll get into what that means, I think increases the resilience of these effects to soil from climate change, and also to water quality from climate change. So how we define soil health is that soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. It's a principle, and it also has a couple of practices tied to it that I'll get at here. But what makes healthy soil? What makes soil healthy? Well, first, healthy soils have a lot of organic matter. So you can see here 2 pictures, the same soil type, except the difference is that one was a forested area and one was an area that's been in heavily disturbed, heavy use agricultural area for 17 years. And the organic matter content, or the amount of carbon in the soil from leaf decay, roots, all of that, is way less in this agricultural soil than it is in this forest soil. And we would say that this forest soil is way healthier, especially in this case because it has a much higher organic matter content. And so that's one feature of healthy soil. And organic matter actually forms the basis for soil life. So everything that's in the soil, all the microorganisms, you guys have seen earthworms, but there's also fungi, as you see on the right here, and arthropods, little tiny insects. There's nematodes and bacteria, all these things. Well, they all depend on soil organic matter to live. That's the base of the food chain in the soil. But a healthy soil, one characteristic of it is that it is full of life. So, there's a really wide diversity of things that live in the soil. I'll give you an example. So in an average handful of healthy soil, you'll have more than 50 billion bacteria, 2 billion actinomycetes, which are another microorganism, up to 100 million or many miles worth of fungus. You can see, all these little mycelia on the right here in this picture, those are fungi. Over 50 million protozoa, which are a little bit bigger than bacteria. Maybe 10,000 nematodes, which are really small worms, over 1,000 arthropods, and maybe a few earthworms. So you think healthy soil, living soil, you think earthworms. Well, that's actually a minority of what's actually living in a handful of healthy soil. And also, one other concept to understand is that healthy soils have good aggregate stability. And what I mean by that is kind of demonstrated by these pictures. You can see these little round clods of soil in the handful of soil there, or on the right here. The soil is holding itself together. Well, that's because all of these fungal mycelia and all of these microorganisms in the soil kind of have that effect over time on the soil, and that is what we when soil holds together, that's what we call aggregate stability. And we'll get at why that's important for healthy soil in terms of its resilience to impacts from climate change in a minute. But that's what I mean by aggregate stability is that it's not just a powdery substance. It's actually, you know, kind of diverse, and there are pores of air in between these soil aggregates that allow for water to come in and for soil life to flourish. And then the last thing, healthy soils are not left bare or exposed. So you can see on the right here, you have an exposed soil that's been tilled recently. It's been mixed up and turned over. And that's a traditional and conventional agricultural practice, but that degrades soil health. So when we talk about healthy soils, you know, typically a healthier soil is one that has not seen as much disturbance like that. Like on the left here, you can see we've got corn growing with a lot of residue underneath it. Maybe that was a cover crop that was grown and then knocked down, and then the corn was planted into it. So the more that we have the soil covered, the healthier the soil is going to be. So now getting at the question here of how is healthy soil more resilient to climate change impacts? Well, soil carbon or soil organic matter, which is that richness, that darkness in the soil that I showed you just a couple slides ago, actually improves the moisture holding capacity and helps prevent the negative effects of drought in soil. So it increases the resilience of soil to drought, because the organic matter will kind of help the soil hold water even when it hasn't rained for a while. You can see that from this study here on the right. We've got a correlation of moisture content on the y-axis and soil organic matter or organic carbon on the x-axis. And you can see that moisture content in these samples with different amounts of soil organic matter increased as you increased soil organic matter. So it's a positive relationship there, which, you know, there's a lot of research behind that, but that's why we try to promote soil organic matter with farmers, is because it helps them increase their soil moisture capacity, which makes it more resilient to things like drought. Another way that healthy soil makes that healthy soil is more resilient to climate change impacts is that soil aggregate stability that I mentioned earlier helps keep soil in place, preventing erosion, which is caused by those heavy rain events that are going to become more frequent with climate change. And this is with the help of roots of plants and fungi that kind of hold it in place, like you see in the picture there. But you know, when it rains hard, if the soil is held together by all these microorganisms and roots and things like that, you're going to get a lot less erosion. At the same time, along with that, soil aggregate stability and those roots help increase drainage because they create pore spaces in the soil, which prevents flooding and also erosion. So you've got more drainage and you've got less erosion. So you can see here, you know, these pore spaces get filled up with water and it drains better when you have more pore spaces, as opposed to flooding, and then, you know, you get pooling of water, then you start to get more erosion and kind of loss of that soil structure. So when you have really healthy soil aggregates, they can treat and process and filter out water much better than a soil that is not healthy, that doesn't have very much soil aggregate stability. So that's a little bit more complex, but that's something we really want to emphasize, and aggregate stability might be, I think, the most important feature of a soil in terms of creating resilience to climate change impacts. Another way is that earthworms and other soil life help increase drainage through creating pore spaces in the soil. They also help contribute to that aggregate stability, you know, those little aggregates we talked about, but you know, earthworms and other soil life have the same effect and kind of interact with the soil in a way that helps prevent erosion and flooding. And actually, they're adding organic matter to the soil too, so they help it maintain moisture as well. And then one thing to mention as a side point, which I think is really important in the context of climate change, is that organic matter in soil is also a carbon sink. So if you talk about, you know, capturing carbon and trying to prevent climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, adding organic matter to soil or using practices that help organic matter be maintained in soil actually makes us reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester greenhouse gases. So in the US each year, adoption of best management practices, which I'm going to be talking about, but practices that increase organic matter, have led or can lead to the sequestration or the capture of 83 to 270 million metric tons of carbon, which is a lot. So we'll get into that a little bit more. But it's a really important way, improving organic matter content in soil is a really important way of reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so for the last bit of this talk, I want to help us focus on and understand some of the different both agricultural and just general land management practices that can help to improve soil health and therefore help improve the resilience of the soil to climate change. And the principles behind these practices are four things. One is to maximize the living roots on the soil, so try not to leave the soil bare. Another is maximizing biodiversity, so having not just one type of plant grow, but having multiple kinds of plants grow on a soil. That helps build the soil and improve soil health, improve soil life. Those are both in the feeding category. And then on the other side, protecting the soil, we want to minimize disturbance, so minimizing the amount that the soil is plowed or tilled or mixed up or excavated. And maximizing soil cover. So having live or dead vegetation, anything that can prevent, that active erosion from happening on the soil. So those fit within the protection. And we're trying to protect soil aggregates and organism habitat. So organism, by that I mean talking about earthworms and bacteria, things like that, and protecting soil organic matter. So a couple of practices that do this are cover crops, no-till agriculture, composting, adding growing grassed waterways or filter strips around waterways, adding conservation buffers in areas that are prone to erosion, and doing certain types of grazing, like adding grazing fences around waterways or doing rotational grazing. So I'll explain each of these a little bit more in detail. And then we'll talk a little bit about, if you're a farmer, if you're not a farmer, what could you do? And who could you talk to make some of these impacts and make some of these changes? So the first one is cover crops. And I could give a whole talk on that. I actually gave a lot of workshops on that this fall. So I'd love to take questions on this, but briefly, there's a number of different kinds of cover crops, but in general, the idea of planting a cover crop is, after a farmer has harvested their crop in, say, September, whether it was corn or squash or things like that, you plant something so that the soil is not left bare throughout the winter, and so that in the spring, before you can plant things, because it's free, on and off frosts in the spring, you have something growing on the soil, and that prevents erosion because you've got an active living cover on the soil. It actually also improves soil health because, all these soil microorganisms need living roots to be able to have something to eat. And you can see on the right here, all these roots, this is winter rye, one of our common cover crops. All these roots are providing sources of food for soil microorganisms, as well as stabilizing the soil against erosion in that whole off season of farming. And then third, on the left here, you see underneath the corn, there's that residue that's left over. So when you plant a cover crop, you can actually knock it down and leave the residue. And throughout the season, as the corn's growing up, that helps prevent erosion underneath the corn, right? And it also helps improve moisture retention. So talking about climate change, if we have drought, and you have if you have a cover crop growing there, you might actually reduce the amount of moisture that leaves the soil because you have a mulch, a cover on that soil. So cover crops have a number of different benefits. Those are just a few of them. No-till farming or no-till agriculture is another practice that we can promote for to increase our resilience to climate change. And so you can see here on the left, no-till, one part of it is that you leave the residue of the crop, and that in the same way that cover crops help prevent erosion, that prevents erosion because you're intercepting that rainwater with something on the surface of the soil. Whereas on the bottom right here, you can see if it rained there, you might get a lot more active erosion than on the top left here. Or the top right here, you can see a cover crop. Often when you do no-till, you plant directly into the residue of a cover crop. That's what's happening in this picture here. There's a no-till drill dragged behind a tractor that the tractor has a crimper roller on the front, which is pushing down the cover crop, and they're planting directly into it, probably corn seed. And so, that really reduces the amount of erosion that's happening in the planting process, as opposed to what would be going on in the bottom right corner here. And another important part of that is that no-till farming can sequester a lot of carbon. On average, it sequesters 3 metric tons of carbon per acre per year, which is about the same as what is emitted by about 2,700 miles driven in your average car. So that's per acre. So imagine you've got a farm of 80 acres. Well, that's, if you do no-till, it's like you're reducing and removing the amount of carbon driven by, your average couple people in a year. So that's pretty significant. Another is to add compost, another important practice. So adding compost to gardens or farm soils builds soil organic matter, soil health, and therefore increases the resilience to drought. Because like we said, higher organic matter in the soil means you have better moisture retention in the soil. So you get more water in the soil, even during times of drought. So adding compost really helps with that. And it also brings in or inoculates the soil with not just organic matter, but healthy doses of beneficial bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and microorganisms, microarthropods. So it's a really important kind of source or boost of soil health. It's the same principle of like if someone, had digestive distress and they took a probiotic. It's kind of like that, but for the soil. So another important practice, especially in terms of reducing erosion, is to use grassed waterways and filter strips. So you can see in these pictures here, I'm sorry they're a little bit blurry, but you can see at all the low points in this field, this farmer has installed permanent grass waterways. And, that picture that we started off with a lot of erosion on a crop field, that's what you're trying to avoid by doing a grassed waterway. So you can actually prevent loss of sediment, pesticides, fertilizers, and other pollutants from soils to waterways after heavy rains by putting in grassed waterways. So that grass, the idea is that it will capture any of those sediments and filter them out before they reach our water bodies. Capture fertilizers and pesticides as well. So maintaining a healthy filter strip in your field can provide erosion control and trap that pollution before it enters our surface waters. Similarly, it's really helpful to have buffers directly around our waterways, or if, in this case, you can use buffer or filter strip interchangeably, but the idea is that these protect our water bodies from polluted runoff, and they also provide habitat to things that want to move through the landscape but need forests to do so, for example. And they can also provide shade to streams, keeping them cool, which is especially important if we're going to have higher extreme temperatures in light of climate change. So on the right here, you can see a great forested buffer along this river running through the agricultural landscape. And that really does make a big difference in terms of filtering out pollutants and keeping our rivers cool. Another important practice is using livestock fencing to maintain buffers around streams. So when livestock come in and out of rivers freely, they cause a lot of erosion, like you see in the top left there. In the bottom right, you can see the fence around the river, and that actually really helps to prevent the amount of erosion that's happening, the amount of pollutants that are happening, because you're not having the cattle or horses or whatever it might be accessing the stream. And the last practice that I'll mention is called rotational grazing. So you can see a diagram of that on the top right and a picture of it in action on the bottom right there. So the idea is that you use temporary fencing to rotate livestock on pastures frequently to avoid too much vegetation removal and erosion. So in this picture, you can see on the left, the cattle have done a lot of eating of that grass, so it's about time for them to move on. If they stayed on that landscape for too long, you would start to see bare soil, and the soil would become more prone to erosion. And that could affect our waterways and the productivity of the soil, the health of the soil. So the more frequently that you move animals, even if it's a smaller space, the better. And so you want to move them, you can see here on the bottom, they're moving them kind of across this landscape, and by the time they're on the last one, they can move them back to the first one because it will have grown back, as opposed to having them eat all of that whole field all at once and not have anywhere else to go. So this helps a lot with preventing erosion. So to wrap up, before I have some questions, conservation agriculture is part of the solution to climate change, both building resilience in our soils and to our waterways and capturing carbon. You can see on the left to the right here, the difference between an area that doesn't have a grassed waterway and one that does. A lot more erosion, right? So these practices help lessen the impacts of climate change on our soils and therefore also on water quality. Because as we mentioned on the left here, you can see how soil erosion would be impacting water quality. And one other stat, Project Drawdown says that conservation agriculture could take in over 9 gigatons of carbon dioxide in the next 30 years. That's globally, so if it were implemented well. And that's about equivalent to the annual global fossil fuel emissions. And the data I got from was from 2014. So, the total emissions in 1 year of the whole world from fossil fuels could be taken back into the soil in 30 years by conservation agriculture practices. And that's pretty significant. So managing for soil health is investing in water management. Increasing the resilience of our soils increases the resilience of our water bodies as well. I hope that was apparent in some of these practices. So what can you do if you're not a farmer? Well, one thing you can do is know which farm you get your food from and ask about the soil conservation practices. We work with a lot of farmers in the county, and there's an office in every county. And a lot of them are implementing really great practices like cover crops, no-till agriculture, fencing for livestock. So, if you get your stuff from a farmer's market, or if you can ask the store where they get their stuff, you can try to support farmers, buy produce and meat from farmers who are doing good practices. I try to buy all my meat from farm stands and from farmers markets. And there are organizations, especially in Worcester, that make that produce more accessible to people. You can start a garden at your house and use cover crops, compost, or crop rotation, some of these different principles to improve the soil health right in your backyard, and provide some of your own food as well. As far as community involvement, you could point out places of erosion at your school or in your town. Like you see on the left here, that's just in someone's schoolyard, right? And there's bad land management happening there, and you're getting erosion of the soil. And you can also consider ways to prevent erosion, like capturing runoff from a parking lot before it goes into the lawn or goes into a farm field with rain gardens or bioswales, which I'm hoping you'll get some more talks about in the future. And if your family has livestock or horses, make sure they're not degrading the pastures. Try to convince them to move them more frequently, or have maybe one small sacrifice area and use your pastures sustainably. So those are a few of the different practices, and I hope this was a good review of some of the ways that we can prevent impacts of climate change or lessen the impacts of climate change on our soils and build healthy soils that will help us to be more prepared for climate change that's going to happen. So thanks for that, and I appreciate the opportunity to work with Envirothon, and I hope that this is helpful for all of you, and I'd love to take some questions.
Thanks,
see some
Joel.
questions here.
Yeah, do you want to just open the question and answer and respond? That's the easiest way. Go.
Sure. So one attendee asked, are there any monetary costs that come with implementing better soil conservation practices? That is a great question. And yes, for example, Using cover crops costs money because you have to buy the seed and run the tractor to plant it. So that's a cost. Sometimes if you want to start no-till agriculture, not all farmers have a no-till seeding drill, which is that implement you saw behind the tractor. So that can cost money. Another, compost by itself, if you can generate it on site, would be free. But a lot of people at a large scale would have to buy a compost. So that would be, a way. So there are costs to all these, but the good thing is actually offices like mine with funds from the federal government through the US Department of Agriculture have cost share programs for all of these practices. So we actually pay farmers to plant cover crops. They just have to get a conservation plan with us. And the conservation planning process helps farmers and landowners understand some of these benefits that I'm talking about and kind of understand the logistics of some of these practices. And so we'll actually help, provide that technical assistance and then provide a share of that cost and sometimes cover the whole cost of those purchases. The state of Massachusetts actually had a grant program for a while and may still have a grant program that provides funding for people to purchase no-till planting drills. So, there are programs available for people. So I appreciate that question. So another question, does using clover instead of grass in residential yards make a difference in soil conservation? Great question. So clover is a plant that actually fixes nitrogen into the soil from the atmosphere. It's a legume. And that by itself really does help promote healthy soil. And clover also typically has a deeper root than our lawn grass, depending on what kind it is. So those two things can benefit soil health over general lawn grass. But I would say, yes, in general, having clover is better, not just for the soil, but also for anything that might be living on the in your lawn. For example, that clover provides flowers, grass doesn't. So you might have a benefit for pollinators as well. So there's other benefits of increasing the diversity of your lawn. I actually am in favor of and try to work in support of people replacing their lawns with pollinator gardens, vegetable gardens, trees, because I think in general lawn is not very much of a conservation practice. It uses a lot of water. It uses chemicals, and the roots of lawn grass are really shallow. So soil health is not as benefited by that as it would be by a more diverse plant assemblage like a garden. So one more question here I see. What is the main issue preventing farmers from implementing better soil conservation practices? Great question. So I would say there's a couple of different reasons why, and I'm still learning this in the case of Massachusetts because I started working here about a year ago. But there are people who have been doing cover crops and even no-till agriculture for decades, and there are people who still don't want to change their practices in that way. And I think one thing is costs, and that's why we try to provide these cost share programs for people so that that's not a barrier. Another is just it's a different way of doing things, and people aren't used to it. And in some cases, people are concerned that it might affect the productivity of their production. So, some people are worried that if you don't till, your soil won't be supple enough and light enough to or drain well enough to support a healthy crop. But there's a lot of studies out there showing that that's not the case, and in some cases, when it is possibility that you reduce your productivity because of some of these practices, there are usually tips and tricks to avoid those issues. It also, depends on the weather of the year. So there's a lot of subtlety there, and I would say, generally, most farmers in Massachusetts use cover crops, and those who don't have a reason for it, and usually it's related to production. That's just cover crops. But when it comes to grazing, rotational grazing, or fences or filter strips, oftentimes it's just lack of knowledge of those practices and maybe lack of funds to kind of start doing that. So maybe they need help to buy fences. We also support farmers who want to start rotationally grazing or put a fence around a stream. So I think there's a lot of progress being made, and it just takes work. Are there any more questions?
You know what, Joel, this is Will. I'm trying to figure out how to ask a question, and I can't figure out how to type it in. So
That's all right. I think it's because you're not an attendee in the same way.
Okay, can I just ask then?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was really struck by your you're saying that sequestration potential, carbon sequestration potential in soil worldwide is equivalent to our fossil fuel use worldwide every year. Is that what you said?
Yeah, but but it's over a 30-year period. So in 30 years, we could capture the amount of carbon released from fossil fuel use in 1 year.
In 1 year.
So we have a long ways to go.
Okay.
It's not the only way. We have to capture carbon in other ways and reduce. Really, comes down to we have to reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting in the atmosphere, because it was roughly the amount that is released in 1 year from fossil fuel use is the amount that we could capture in 30 years globally.
Okay. So
and that was from a few different sources, so it's a rough estimate.
Yeah. So we often hear about tree planting and wood in living trees as a carbon sequestration technique. Can you compare growing forests versus organic farming practices in terms of soil carbon sequestration? That's a tough question, I know.
Yeah, well, definitely.
I'm curious how,
well, I think,
in general,
yeah, I don't have the numbers, but that's a really good question. I don't have the numbers, but I know that forest has a lot more potential for capturing carbon than conservation agriculture for a couple of reasons. You think of, with conservation agriculture, you can only put carbon downward, right? With forests, you're capturing carbon in the roots of trees, and you're capturing carbon in the trunks and leaves of trees. And you're building soil carbon by adding a leaf layer every year. So there's a number of different ways that trees capture more carbon than, say, using cover crops and no-till agriculture would. Because if you have a forest, it is no-till by default. You're not disturbing the soil. So that's already capturing more carbon in the soil. And you're capturing all that carbon in the growth of the plant, which accumulates every year. So especially in areas that aren't currently forested, planting trees and encouraging forest growth captures a lot more carbon. And especially in the tropics, where you've got just these huge and lush forests that are year-round. There's a lot of carbon capture potential there. But that's not to downplay the importance of conservation agriculture, because we need agriculture to provide our food, and we might as well do it in a way that captures carbon instead of releases it.
Right, and if
forests are really important.
If we eat local food, we're spending less on fossil fuel to transport it from distant places too.
That too, and there's a lot more ways that we can change our agricultural practices to reduce impacts on climate too, but I didn't focus on those because they weren't related to the water management issue. But yeah, that's one of them for sure. Any more questions? And my contact info is there for anyone who wants to reach out. I usually would be able to meet with teams, and I still can if we're willing to meet outside or meet on Zoom with any questions that, especially related to soils or water.
Thank you, Joel. It's really great to go into depth, so to speak, in one aspect of this.
You could say to dig in.
To dig into this water management issue, yes.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad. And I hope that this can be used by others in the future. Glad to give this talk to any team that wants it.
Okay,
I'm
thank
out.
you. Are we all set, Britta?
I think so. Thank you so much, Joel. Thanks everybody who was able to attend today, and we'll catch you the next time.
Yeah, thank you for participating.